to conquer Egypt and have a good base of operations with which to then attack Jerusalem. So he goes to Egypt, he arrives, he conquers the city of Damietta, then he begins his advance onto Cairo, and while he's advancing onto Cairo, his army is unfortunately encircled, and he is defeated. He has to surrender. So he surrenders. He and many of his nobles were captured by the Muslims. A good portion of his army was actually slaughtered by the Muslims. So Louis, while he's in captivity, he is able to strike a deal with the Muslims to allow for his release. And the deal that he struck with them was that the Christians would return the city of Damietta that they had just captured, and he would pay a ransom in order to be set free. And the ransom that he agreed to pay was 800,000 bezants, which roughly equated to his entire annual income. So he basically agreed to pay everything I earned in a year in order for his captivity. Now, although with a stipulation that if he paid half, he would then be allowed to go free. Again, with the stipulation that he had to pay the rest of it. So in May of 1250, after a short captivity, he was released after he paid half of the ransom. Now, Louis's nobles at the time realized the crusade is over, the crusade is done, our army is decimated, we didn't succeed, it's time to go home. Louis allows those nobles who wanted to go home, back to France, to go, but he decides to stay in the Holy Land. He goes to Jerusalem, and in effect, over the next 4 years, he is really the king of Jerusalem. He's not officially given that title, but because of his stature, because of his leadership, he really governs the whole kingdom of Jerusalem and establishes it and puts it into a better footing. He builds up defensive fortifications and really has Jerusalem, the kingdom's welfare in his heart at all times. He actually even garrisons 100 knights at his own expense in the kingdom of Jerusalem, which is an awful lot of money. Because when you garrison a knight, you pay for a knight, you're not just paying for the one knight, you're paying for his squires, you're paying for his horse, all his weapons, feed and forage for the horse. It's a very expensive undertaking. So it equates to really about 1,000 people that he paid for permanently to stay in the Holy Land. He was very concerned with the Holy Land. He leaves the Holy Land after being gone from France for 6 years. The Holy Land would continue to dominate his thoughts. He continued to send large amounts of money and contributions to the Crusaders who remained in order to help them, to guard and defend the Holy Land against the Muslims. Now, in 1268, the ancient Christian city of Antioch, one of the Crusader states, falls. A Muslim ruler by the name of Baybars comes and attacks and conquers the city. And so St. Louis, as a result of this news, the fall of Antioch, decides to go on crusade once again. And this is the 8th and final crusade against the Muslims in the Holy Land. Now, there's a big contrast between this crusade and Louis's first crusade. Louis was a much younger man when he went on his first crusade. He's now in his 50s, and he's not really in good health when he goes on his second crusade. He decides to land in Tunisia, in Africa, in 1270, but when he makes camp, when he arrives in Tunisia, unfortunately disease breaks out in the Crusader camp, including dysentery. Louis's son dies in the camp. Unfortunately, the papal legate also dies in the camp, and then eventually Louis contracts the disease and dies as well. He died on August 25th, 1270, and it's said that his last words were Jerusalem, Jerusalem. He always held Jerusalem in his mind, and he considered it his duty as a Christian king to try to liberate the city from the Muslims. But again, he was unsuccessful. He was the last major monarch of Europe to go on crusade. And really, with the death of King St. Louis IX, the crusading movement really comes to an end in terms of going to the Holy Land and trying to reconquer the Holy Land. The Crusades of St. Louis were some of the most well-funded, they were some of the most well-organized crusades of all history, but they unfortunately were unsuccessful. The Crusader states would exist for a little bit longer, for 20 years after the death of St. Louis, but unfortunately the last Christian outpost, the city of Accra, would fall to a Muslim army in 1291, and now at the end of the 13th century, all the Crusader states are completely gone. All the Crusader states are completely gone. So the Christians had occupied land in the Holy Land for less than 200 years. So for less than the history of the United States of America, were there permanent outposts of Christians in the Holy Land. It's important to remember, especially when we consider our modern world, and how a lot of times the Crusades are used in terms of saying this is why Muslims dislike the West. This is why September 11th happened, because of the Crusades. And it's interesting, again, to just maintain our historical context and realize that the Crusades only occupied 200 years of that region's history. A region that has its history going back for thousands of years. And it was not really until the 19th century that the Crusades became more of a focus in the Muslim mind. For the most part, the Crusades were forgotten in Islam, primarily because they won. And it was not something that, it didn't last very long either. And so it wasn't until the 19th century and into the 20th century where really the Crusades became this focus in the Muslim world. It was primarily because of European colonialism in the 20th century. When the British and the French in the 19th century, the British and the French came in and began to colonize parts of the Holy Land, and Palestine in particular. And that's when this whole understanding of the Crusades being an offense against the Muslims really come into the picture. Just one brief example of how the consciousness of the Crusades had fallen far out of Muslim minds is in the 19th century, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany traveled to Damascus searching for the tomb of Saladin. He wanted to go to Saladin's tomb and lay a wreath. And he had on this wreath a little placard that said, from one great emperor to another. And because Saladin in the Western mind has over time, from the time of the Crusades, has just been built up as this great and noble and worthy general, the one that Christian kings should emulate through different literature and whatnot. But he goes and he has a trouble when he's in Damascus even finding the tomb of Saladin. Can't find it. Nobody knows where it is. It's not a prominent place of visitation at all. He eventually finds the tomb, and when he goes to the tomb, he's shocked to find that it's in complete disrepair. And so this is illustrative of this great Saladin, this great Muslim ruler. His tomb was completely ignored by the Muslims in Damascus for centuries. And so then eventually what he does is he uses his own money to pay for the restoration of the tomb. Isn't that just interesting that a Christian king, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, gives his own money in order to build up this tomb again. So just a brief vignette of how this whole understanding of the Crusades has really been warped. And so I encourage more study. If you're interested in this period of time, take time out to read some of the suggested readings we have in your workbook and focus more on this time period, because it's very crucial for us to know the history of this time period because it affects us so much even today. Now, the Crusading movement was over in terms of going to the Holy Land, but was not completely over because there's a situation in the south of France in the 13th century where a heresy erupts, and the church responds to this heresy first through peaceful means, but then ultimately she responds through the calling of a crusade. And the heresy that arose in the south of France in the 13th century was a heresy of Albigensianism, called because it was centered around the town of Albi in the south of France, in the Provence. Now, the Albigensian is also known as Catharism. The Cathari were the heretics that were neo-Gnostics. And we talked about the Gnostics before. Remember how I said that heresy throughout the church's history is kind of like that state fair game of whack-a-mole? That you have the game, the mole pops up, try to hit it with the hammer, and then it pops down, and it pops up over here, you try to hit it over here, you're just trying to hit the heresy back and forth and back and forth. It's like whack-a-mole. Heresies never really ever go away. What they do is the church responds to the heresy, maybe goes underground and latent for a while, but then it'll pop up over here later on, morphed into a different strain or a different belief, but pretty much the same fundamental belief, that it still has the same fundamental belief. The same thing with Albigensianism. The church had dealt with Gnosticism before in the early stages of the church's history. St. Augustine wrote against the neo-Gnostics and the Manichaeans. So now we have, though, this heresy come back. And just to refresh our memory of what the Gnostics believe and what the Cathari believed as well, is that the Gnostics believe in a dualistic system, that there's a good God and a bad God, a God of goodness, a God of light, and a God of darkness and of evil, and that the good God created everything that was spiritual. So our souls are good because they're created by this good God. Our bodies and everything that's material are bad, and they're created by this bad God, the God of evil, the God of darkness. And so what you have to do as a Gnostic, as a Cathari, is you believe that certain things you cannot practice certain things. Things like marriage and the marital act are forbidden in the Cathari belief, because to engage in the marital act is to produce new life, and you're imprisoning a good soul into a bad material body. The highest form of worship in Cathari belief is to commit suicide, because again, you release your good soul from this bad material body. And so what Cathari did, why they were so effective in the south of France and such a problem to the church, is they even established a counter-church, where they organized themselves hierarchically, where they had priests or people who actually administered their sacraments, that they called. And these people who administered these sacraments and their rituals were known as the perfect. They were the people who fully embraced all of Catholic belief. The people who renounced marriage, the people who refused to eat meat and eggs and any type of food that came from a material animal. They were the ministers of the Catholic Church. They even included the perfect, even included among their numbers women. So the heresy, now we have this heresy in the south of France, Albigensianism, Catholicism. We have to take a step back in just a moment and answer the question, why is heresy bad? Why should the church respond to heresy, especially in the calling of a crusade, which the church did here with the Albigensian crusade? Because we have to think of and remember that a heretic is a threat not only to the church and the teachings of the church, but a heretic is also, during this time in European history, a threat to European society, a threat to the secular order. And so not only, and the heretic is seen as an active threat, not just a passive threat. Not only does the heretic threaten to take the souls and put souls of people in danger, but the heretic also causes revolt and disruption in secular society. So secular rulers and princes, for the most part, were very, wanted to be very effective, wanted to ensure that they taught or they addressed heresy in order to try to ensure that peace remained in their realm. There was usually a lot of public outcry when heresy erupted. People were very hostile to heretics. So there you have this whole hostile situation with heretics and heresy arising. It's a threat not only to the church, but also to the public order. The church usually saw the duty of combating heresy was placed on bishops, on the shoulder of bishops, and also on the secular rulers. And as we'll see when we come back from our break, the rulers in the south of France, both the bishops and the secular rulers, failed in their duty to combat heresy. And so Pope Innocent III has to step in, and this is what he does, is he calls for a crusade to end the heresy. And we'll talk about that when we come back from our break. Welcome back to Epic, a journey through church history. We're discussing the time period of Crusaders and Scholars. We're on the third and final session of our discussion of this important period in church history. This is the period of the high watermark of Christendom, the glory of Christendom, as one historian has called it. And a lot of activity going on in this period of time. Military and political activity through the Crusades that we've talked about, spiritual activity in terms of the rise of the Franciscans and the Dominicans, and the sense of holiness attracting and people coming back to the faith and of living the faith more authentically through the witness and example and the preaching and teaching of the Dominicans and Franciscans. And we also have, as we'll see in this time together, the rise of intellectual activity and the rise of the scholastics and the important contribution that these scholars make to not only the church and her theology and philosophy, but also even to the thought of Western civilization. So before our break, we were discussing the Albigensian heresy, the heresy that arose in the south of France in the 13th century. And the Albigensians and the Cathari were basically neo-Gnostics, and they believed in this dualistic system of the spiritual and the soul being good, and matter and the body being bad. And they established a counter-church, and there were many converts to Catharism in the south of France. We talked how the church saw that the role of the bishop and the role of the secular prince is, one of their roles is to combat and confront heresy when it arises in their realms or in their dioceses. Unfortunately, in the south of France, there was this period of time where there was a lot of corrupt clergy who did not did not live up to their promise of celibacy, did not live up in terms of an imitation of Christ as they should have, and were just also ill-formed in the faith, and didn't have really the education or even the desire to have the education to preach and teach the authentic faith to their people when confronted by this heresy. So the heresy began to spread and it became a huge problem in the south of France. Now the church, for several years, before the 13th century actually even, had sent missionaries and had sent priests and good priests and bishops into the region to try to stop the heresy, to try to get those people, the heretics who were believing in the false teaching, to bring them back into communion with the church. And unfortunately, they had a very difficult time in succeeding in doing that. And so what ends up happening is Innocent III is our pope during this time of the Albigensian Crusade, the Albigensian heresy, and he sends a papal legate to Count Raymond of Toulouse, who was one of the major rulers in the south of France. He sends this legate to talk with him about trying to address the problem of heresy in the south of France. Count Raymond VI of Toulouse actually was related to the Count Raymond that we talked about in the First Crusade. So this line of good, of counts who ruled the south of France. Raymond VI unfortunately did not live up to his namesake in being a faithful son of the church, and didn't do enough to actually eradicate the heresy in his realm. So this papal legate is sent to have a meeting and to undertake negotiations with Count Raymond. Unfortunately, the meeting wasn't very productive. It was somewhat antagonistic. And the next morning, when the meeting ended, the legate left and was on his way out of Toulouse when he was murdered mysteriously. Now, there's still no historic proof, undeniable proof that Raymond VI was involved in the papal legate's murder. But it was assumed at the time, and is presumed even today, that Raymond did have some, at least, knowledge of the event, if he didn't, in fact, even order it. So this legate was killed. News of the legate's death came back to Innocent III, and he was very, very upset and furious, because an attack on a papal representative is an attack on the very person of the Pope, because this legate represents the Pope and acts in his name. So Innocent III decided that there could be no more preaching, no more non-violent means with which to deal with this heresy. That time had come, it had gone, it was not successful, so now a crusade needed to be preached. So he preached the crusade to go and to eradicate this heresy of Albigensianism in the south of France. Now, we said earlier when we talked about Innocent III that he brought a lot of innovations to the crusading movement. And one of the innovations that he brought to the movement in this particular period of time is that he changed the view of what a crusade really was. I remember before how I focused on it, Urban II, when he called the First Crusade, the focus of the crusade was on an armed pilgrimage. That warriors were going to a specific place of pilgrimage to liberate the Holy City, to go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Well, now, if you're attacking a heresy, if you're launching a crusade against a heresy, there is no real place of pilgrimage for these warriors to go. So he changed the view of the crusade of being a pilgrimage to being a period of military service. And so the annual period of military service that a vassal owed to his lord in terms of feudal society was 40 days military service. So Innocent III preached the crusade and said if you went to the south of France and fought against the heretics and the secular rulers who were protecting them, and did that for 40 days, the annual time of military service required by a vassal, and you can receive all the benefits that are accompanying a crusade. You can receive the full indulgence, the plenary indulgence, receive protection of your property and of your family. And so men responded to this call and went down to the south of France and engaged in a crusade against the secular rulers and the heretics, the secular rulers who were protecting the heretics and the heretics themselves. Now, unfortunately, this caused a problem for the Albigensian Crusade because it caused a manpower problem. What happened is that you'd have groups of men show up to fight, and then after the 40 days of service was over, regardless of whether or not any objectives had been met, they then left and went home. And then another batch would come later, and they would stay for a period of time and then go home. So you have this constant influx of men coming in and out of the region, and made it very difficult for the leaders of the crusade to actually bring about a unified response and have any kind of serious, organized, and constructive campaign against the crusade. The crusade lasted for a total of 18 years, from 1208 to 1226, and really what it was a very bloody civil war. So most of the people who participated in the crusade were northern French knights. And they would come down to the south of France and campaign for the 40 days, and then they would leave. And so it caused this real period of unrest and civil war in the south of France. And before this time, the south of France was very independent of the French king. There was a history of independency in the south of France, and really there are many towns that were in the south of France that were more powerful than the lord that was technically over the town. This was a very different structured governmental system in the south of France, where you had the creation of these towns and the city councils that were very powerful, and at times even more powerful than secular rulers. We even have instances and examples and accounts of city councils, of lords, of noblemen, actually being vassals of the city, of a